Colorizer is a master material designed to create new materials in a quick, easy, and fun way. I originally made it to create different skins for the weapons, but it can be used for anything. To change the color of the character's t-shirt, the reflectivity and color of the vehicle, or just the color of a simple wall. Normally you would have to use external 3D applications like Substance Painter, and then export the textures back into Unreal, which is very time-consuming. I wanted to be able to make as many changes as possible in Unreal. Colorizer can be used with unique meshes like the gun, but also with tiling materials, trim sheets, etc. Colorizer also comes with dozens of camouflage patterns, and this number is still growing. Another feature is a triplanar function, which we will talk about a little later in this video. Colorizer works in two modes, with or without the ColorID texture. Without it, all changes will affect the whole material. With ColorID texture you can have up to 4 parts to manipulate. For example, you can change the color of the gun barrel to red, the plastic grip to blue, the main frame to winter camouflage, and the manipulators to gold. For simple cases like trim sheets, tiling textures, simple meshes, you can simply create your own ColorID textures by simply painting them in any 2D software. For more complicated geometry like this pistol, you need to bake it. I will show you how to do this in a separate video. The process is quite fast, simple, and you don't need any experience. We will use the free Blender to bake the ColorID and the free GIMP for small adjustments. You don't need high poly mesh or source file, we will work on exported low poly mesh from Unreal Engine. I prefer to work with RMA pack textures for roughness, metalness, and AO, but if you prefer to work the other way, Colorizer lets you do that. Just check the box and load all textures separately. ColorID is very similar to RMA texture, which uses channel packing to store roughness, metalness, and ambient occlusion maps in a one texture. ColorID uses the same method to store its masks. As you can see, if we isolate just one channel, it becomes white. For the engine, it's information that any changes we make to that channel will only affect those white areas. It's the same with the blue and red channels. The black parts of the texture are all that's left, and we can also apply different things to them. So in overall, we have 4 masks to our disposition. The ColorID texture resolution in this example is 4K, but you can scale it down a lot. 1024 by 1024 works perfectly here, so we have great possibilities and a very small file size. If you reduce the resolution too much, you might notice some bleeding between the masks. It always depends on your mesh and its UV setup. This example is very extreme as we have very visible color differences. If we used more similar colors, we could reduce the texture resolution even further and the bleeding would not be so noticeable. Changing colors with Colorizer will not wash out the original texture information. Think of it like the overlay blend mode in Photoshop. We change the color, but by default white areas are not affected, so all edge wear, scratches, etc. remain untouched. The easiest type of texture to work with are dark textures without any color information. So most guns are a perfect example. If we use wooden grip as our base, it requires a bit more work to change the color to blue, because brown wood color will somehow mix with it. We can use the desaturate slider to wash out all the color information from that part. It will then behave like made in grayscale. And the engine under the hood will do this before we make any other changes, so now we can much easier reproduce the color we want. We can also use the intensity slider to help us even more. Things can get more complicated if we use a white texture as a base, but here with a very high value for the color intensity property, we can achieve a decent result. With Colorizer, you can change the roughness and metalness of your textures. But if we enter value of 1 for metalness, we won't make our mesh fully metallic. Colorizer multiplies the value you enter by the original value stored in the texture. So in this example, my gun is fully metallic to begin with. I can't make it more metallic, so even if I enter an extreme value, nothing will happen. The same goes for the roughness channel. Working with negative values and going beyond the maximum slider value is always the right way to work. Colorizer comes with several camouflage patterns split into pattern types and color schemes. There are also some unique camouflage patterns and non-military patterns. To apply any texture on top of your original one, first select Change Color and choose the white value. Now select the texture. Note that you will still keep all your edge wear details. You can also change the color of the texture and its intensity. The best way to do it is to use the grayscale versions that I included, so that the color on the final texture will be identical to the one you selected. You can also manipulate textures by changing their tiling, moving, and rotating them. When you apply patterns to your mesh, you may find that there is no continuity in many areas. This is due to how your UV islands are positioned, but we can combat this using triplanar projection. It projects 3 separate planes onto your mesh and blends between them to create a more continuous look. To use triplanar, select the appropriate checkbox. Now you can see that the new texture parameter has been shown with the default Unreal Engine texture. Please ignore it, it's a bug. Now we need to select our pattern again, and if you look at your mesh, you will see much better results. You can also change the tiling and position of the texture. Now, triplanar mapping is still not a perfect solution. We will still have some imperfections. This is where the smoothness property can help. As you can see, it changes the amount of blending between the planes. We also have the ability to invert the planes themselves. This, along with the offset and rotation properties, can help us create better transitions between planes. In general, dense patterns such as camouflage are the best way to hide any imperfections. Triplanar is static in Colorizer. This means that changing the position of your mesh in the world will not change the appearance of the texture. This allows you to use Colorizer with things that move or are animated in your project. Thanks to the ColorID texture, we can change the look of the mesh having only one material slot. Of course, we can also work with multiple materials per mesh, which gives us even more options. With 2 materials, we have double the amount of available masks. It's the same situation as having 2 separate objects with exactly the same textures. For example, I created 2 material instances for my gun, woodland and desert skins. Now in the woodland skin, the main frame and the magazine of my gun are green. In the desert skin, I got these parts in brown color. I can apply woodland material to the gun and desert material to the magazine when they are both separate objects. And we'll still use the same textures for both. Colorizer has partial runtime support. All functions work in the editor, but triplanar does not work during the game. Don't get me wrong, materials created with triplanar will be displayed correctly in the game. But if you have, for example, a weapon editor in your game, where players can change colors etc., triplanar will not work there. However, you can still use all the other properties. If you want to be able to change the texture of the pattern during the game, make sure that Use Texture is checked.